Today's weekly chapter Bo is about doing the good and the right. In Deuteronomy 6:18, we find that it talks about do what is good and right and in the sight of the Lord. In this generation principle we know called about the Jewish law as do what is good and right shapes other laws and helps us determine how the commandments should apply to our lives. Should I give it to the person alone, or should the person be judged by his actions? In the Gospels, dear friends, it talks about what a person has to do. We should ask ourselves the question, does this help me to do what is good and right? In 13:3, we find, it says, this means the principles was given from the express purpose of the divine purpose mankind. Overall, this type of understanding and commitment is the covenant between God and the Jewish people. Demands not only that we correct ourselves, but also that our actions enable us to be a light to the nations. Isaiah 42:6. When we do so, we prefer and understand the sanctify God's name in the public by acting responsible and in his examples following all the right deeds and actions also along with the will of God. In the story the death of the firstborn, which Bo talks about, should not be taken literally. Rather, we should learn it in a more spiritual action that God renews and punishes in according with the evil we commit, or measured by measuring the type of good we do. The story reminds us that our world is both modern and moral, a principle in the commitment God commanded us to do, acting previously to contribute to God's moral order. Bo presents us with truths that are also impossible for us to handle. The first plague are also considered. We can imagine the rivers of blood and the streams from the dead fish and dead frogs. We can also laugh as we imagine the Egyptians scattering in the itches from the lices. But the last plague, the death of the firstborn, is as terrific as it is committed. It beautifies seems also commit. The anxiety it imposes tears at the heart, the anxiety of the pillow. The next stress and pain emphasis upon the emotions, because there was a loud cry in Egypt. From there was no house where there was not seen dead, Exodus 12:30. How are we to feel in the cause of such a punishment? How are we to live in a partnership with a God that can impose such horror? How can we handle this truth? On one hand, God acts brings us a sense of justice. It was Pharaoh's favor who imposed gravitation suffering to the Israelites in determining that the case of their children into the river. By throwing their children into the river. It was only when such suffering was visited on his son and his house that he rebelled in the face of God's wrath. And so perhaps God's judgment was simply repaying what Egyptians have done to the Israelites. Overall, this punishment is like a full cup. It is a symbol of complete joy. We cannot celebrate with complete joy knowing the suffering wreaked on the Egyptians by God's judgment on the Pharaoh's hardest heart. I recently speak with someone who was willing to have spent a better part of his adult life studying Jewish history. Overall, his joining in the synagogues and etc. We can understand the millions of all these deaths that happened to the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. This was the cause to show them the might of God. Overall, this all shows us, like in the lives of the Romans and their teachings, that with the very means by which God punished the form, so will punish the letter. He saw in each of these plagues so that God would relieve us from the tragedy of the Romans. In this suffering to their ignorance, they cried out to God to visit a suffering of their advances that would result in their rationalism. There are times in our own experience of suffering that we wish God would act just as God is said to have acted to our ancestors. There are even among us those who believe that it is up to us to take up the sword in action on God's behalf of victory. We look at the sufferings that are around us and we feel guilt and disjustment in experience. The Torah teaches us to having the sense of humanity and justice exemplifies as perhaps a matter of life and death. The text teaches us this week, in the middle of the night of struck down the male's firstborn in the land of Egypt. Exodus 12:29. In the early part of the chapter, we've been looking at part of the other 9 plagues. Only God can know for sure the phrase moment that says in the middle of the night. And as God alone can know the present moments to be sure, so only God is equal to matter to our judgment such as this. In the matter of judgment, the Torah teaches us that we must survey a measure of humanity, a humanity that Pharaoh rejects, meaning sin takes upon us. This ignorance in the judgment leads not only to his own personal trend, but also to the claiming of the entire people of Egypt. We know the appearances that there are some truths that we may never be able to handle. It is the semblance of humans and interact right, the measure of our humanity, and the between sense of our place in the relationship with others and with God. Overall, Baal teaches us why the Pharaoh's sons were struck. Amen.